Great. Emily, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Um, I was just saying with Christine and Tish, it's um, kind of a heavy moment after that keynote to start talking about worksheets. So I really appreciate you all being here. And I'm excited to share with you and learn from you today. I am Emily Metcalf. I'm the Instructional Services Librarian at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. And while it looks like folks are still trickling in just a little bit, I wanted to toss up a little icebreaker in here and just ask you, what's a research topic that stuck out to you? Maybe from a class with students, maybe someone came to you at a reference desk. Go ahead and stick in the chat if any research topics stuck out to you. Um, I feel like librarians tend to have an example or two in a back pocket. I once had length of bumblebee tongues. Caitlin Stewart, what? That's awesome. Oh, the history of tightrope walking. This is awesome. Oh my gosh. I love hearing about these. I think sometimes when we're maybe not at our most generous mood, it's easy to talk about patrons who like made a silly mistake or patrons who were rude to us. We want to kind of like air it out. But this I feel like is a really fun way to share things that maybe like stump us or things that excited us or invoked curiosity. And just looking at all the stuff going on here, like this is incredible. So the annual amount of roadkill in the Chicago area, I wouldn't know where to begin with that, Nicole. That's incredible. So thank you for sharing with me while some folks are still trickling in. It's just, this to me is a universal thing, almost universal in libraries. We all have a story, we all have a research topic that we were just like, what? And it stuck with us. Um, I'm going to go ahead and keep going, but feel free to keep putting these in the chat, and I'm excited to sort of go through them in a little more detail. They're super fun. Um, so before I get, into talking about worksheets, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. I am coming to you, like I said, from Corpus Christi, Texas, or the land colonized as Corpus Christi, Texas. It is a coastal community on the Gulf of Mexico. This space on what was referred to as Turtle Island was originally inhabited by the Ndi or Lipan Apache, the Karankawa, and the Coholticon people, among others whose names we have forgotten, unfortunately. I know there's some conversations going on right now about land acknowledgements and whether they're just sort of performative. And I think these are good questions to ask. But I still think that they serve a purpose in helping us to prevent the erasure of these cultures. So I encourage you to learn about the land you live on and the histories of the people who were there and the stewards who took care of that land. So now we're going to talk about worksheets. I'm going to sort of go through my steps for, first of all, deciding if we want to use a worksheet in an instruction session. And for some context, I tend to work with 50-minute one-shot classes, which I'm guessing some of you are familiar with. It seems like a pretty common way of doing instruction. So I'm going to talk about how do we develop a learning outcome? How do we, that's the vibe up here. I was feeling irreverent. But how do you take stock of your space and technology available and things like that? Then I'm going to give 2 examples of digital worksheets. The first being one that is I deploy in a synchronous live session like we're in today, and one that is an asynchronous example. So something that I can give to classes when either they don't meet synchronously or they don't have time to squeeze me in. So finally, we're going to talk about assessment, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So please, like Christine said, stick your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. So starting at the beginning, the first thing we do when we get a class is we hopefully have a conversation with the professor. And we don't always, to be honest. Sometimes if you get a professor requesting a class who you've worked with a lot before, you're really comfortable, you're like, nah, I know you, I got you, don't worry about it. That's fine, but it's an opportunity, especially if you're working with someone who's new to you or who has a new assignment. We can sit down, talk to the professor, read the assignment, hopefully if they've given it to us more than like an hour before the class. We can sit down, talk it through, and figure out what we need to what students need to be able to do once they're out of our hands, right? This is just developing learning outcomes, which I think most of us we're familiar with, or maybe we're really good at this point. Some folks are. Um, Sometimes when a professor comes to you with a class and you say, "Hey, what would you like your students to be able to do at the end of this session?" And they say, oh, they just need to they need to know how to use the library. I don't love that as an outcome. That can be a lot of different things. And the library can do lots of different things. They can use the library in lots of different ways. So when I get that outcome from professors, I tend to I kind of like it because to me it means like, cool, free reign. I get to do what I want. Here we go. Um, So that means to me, I take a look at a worksheet, or I'm sorry, I take a look at the assignment and I try to get a sense myself of what students are going to need to be able to accomplish. Um, Maybe they just need to get to know some, maybe they need to learn a certain database. Maybe they need to learn how to use our research guides. Maybe they need a subject librarian. The skill that I'm trying to convey is how to reach your subject librarian. Um, Maybe you just need to find the printer, which I would argue is a skill. Uh, Not all of these things require a worksheet, right? So this is developing the learning outcomes is the first step to deciding whether or not we even want to bother with a worksheet. It might not be appropriate for the class. When you're working on a skill, or when you've decided students need to be able to practice a certain skill, like asking research questions or identifying keywords, or they need to be able to utilize a certain database well. Those are things that might be conducive to a worksheet. It's something that they can practice. It's something that they can take home and practice on their own. And they can return to when they might need a refresher later. So those are some candidates for worksheets in my head. When we are developing these learning outcomes, here are some of the questions that I recommend you engage with. First of all, what skills do the students need to be able to perform once they're out of your hands? There's some debate, at least on my campus, about the word skill itself. I'm using it here as kind of a catch-all phrase to mean, anything from students can apply filters to a database, all the way to students can identify bias in a newspaper article. So I'm using it sort of a shorthand for like stuff they can learn at the library, more or less. The next thing is, will they need practice? Is the skill I'm trying to teach something that maybe we could get a little muscle memory going with, or I guess just regular memory? Is that something that we can get to them to a point where they're confident doing this on their own without, a librarian or a professor present? And then finally, I recommend as a last step, asking yourself and being honest with yourself about what is essential, what is absolutely necessary for these students to be able to do. Once we've boiled things down to the essentials, the space that's left, the time that's left, that's space for us to get creative. Maybe we can incorporate an activity. Maybe we give them time to practice and explore on their own. Maybe we have time to build in another skill that we were kind of hoping to squeeze in there but weren't sure would make it. So these are the questions that I ask when I'm being intentional about setting outcomes. And these are the things that can help us get a sense of that worksheet, of the need for a worksheet. But we're not going to make a worksheet yet because step 2 is assessing the vibe. When I say assess the vibe, again, what I'm talking about is take stock of your environment and your collaborator. You're probably already doing this, maybe without naming it. Maybe it's not a practice you're actually thinking of as a step, but it is a step. And it's one we tend to, I think, get pretty good at the longer we're at an institution or the more familiar we become with an institution and our frequent collaborators. So to assess the vibe, I recommend asking questions like this. What is the environment we're going to be in? What does that look like? And this includes, are you going to be in person or online? Are students going to be like craning their neck to see your presentation, or are they going to be following along? Can they see your screen on their screen? Then sort of like part of that, but a little more specific, is what technology do you have access to, and what technology do your students have access to? If we're virtual, then at least at my university, if we're virtual, the students are probably accessing your class from one screen. They don't have several screens. Sometimes they might actually be on a phone screen, which means that an activity where I'm asking them to like follow along with me and use your own search terms, that's hard for them because they can't toggle back and forth, right? Not easily, at least. So that's something to think about. If you are going to a class in person, maybe, that's another thing to think through. Maybe you should go to that class and look at the tech available to you. Is there a projector in this room? And think about, will students be able to bring a laptop to class? So think about these things as well. Is it group work or solo work? Once you've established your learning outcomes, maybe you're starting to think through what you want to do, what you're excited to try out. And if it's something that we can learn as a group, that's awesome. We'll make an activity. If it's something, however, that a student needs to practice on their own, and that might require some like reflection, that's when I'm going to start to lean towards a worksheet, when it's something that can be done independently. And finally, think about the professor you're working with or the faculty member. I'm not saying their opinions should be the most important thing you think about, but it's a factor that I don't want to ignore. Are they open to new activities? Are they a notorious worksheet hater, which I didn't realize was a thing until I came to this university? Surprise, they exist. Or maybe is this the professor that just kind of wants to like leave it in your hands and they're like, it's fine, I trust you. Cool, thank you for the trust. I'm gonna take that and run with it. But maybe it's a professor who wants to build something together with you. These are questions that we, like I said, we kind of deal with automatically once we get to get a feel for the people we work with and the vibe, for lack of a better phrase. There is a better phrase. It's just not coming to my head right now. But I do really recommend working with when you can, when you have a relationship where that works. Sometimes the professors are going to not care. If you are unsure, however, about like, I don't know this person super well, are they gonna like this? Am I gonna get some maybe critical feedback on this? Just send the professor your worksheet and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? What do you see here? And they might send it back to you and be like, looks good. They might not respond at all. Or they might actually give you some really good feedback, which is really, I think, worth incorporating. They have the chance to get to know their students better. They know their assignments better. So it's good feedback to get. So that's step 1 and step 2. We've made some outcomes. We've assessed the vibe. We understand our environment. We've decided a worksheet is appropriate. Here is where we start to build a worksheet. I'm going to go through 2 different kinds of worksheets, like I said earlier. The first one we're going to talk about is a synchronous worksheet. So one we are doing together live. And then I'm going to talk about an asynchronous worksheet in a minute. Synchronous worksheet. This is probably going to look pretty familiar to some people. It is a pretty basic mind map. Mind maps are sort of brainstorming tools, not sort of, they are brainstorming tools. And they can sort of, they can be used as just like very general sort of like thought vomit onto a piece of paper, or they can be created sort of like this with an intentional purpose. The purpose with this one was to get students from thinking about topics into forming research questions. So some of that's why I asked that icebreaker question. And I'm going to pull the chat back up because some of them were really cool. So like the Vikings is one of them. And Mexican ballads about drug trafficking. What? I'm on the Gulf of Mexico. I'm in South Texas and I have never heard about that. So like I have some research to do. But those are sort of topics, right? I have found that I have a lot of trouble getting first year students to come to me with a research question. They tend to come with a topic. And so when they come to our classes and we're trying to do some searching and I'm like, who wants to give me a topic? The topics I get are usually 1 or 2 words. And it's like sharks. My topic is sharks. Cool. We're on, again, coastal community, like sharks are like a big thing, marine biology, like we're here for it. Um, uh, when I ask the student, like, what do you want to learn about sharks? They give me a pretty general, like, oh, I don't know, I just want to learn about sharks. Cool, but I don't know how to research that with you. So this is the tool that I've sort of deployed in classes, to in-person classes initially, to get students to start with a topic, branch out into asking some questions or like thinking about categories and then generating a research question. I am going to jump out of my slides real quick here. Maybe it's escape. Nope, it's not letting me escape. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to now show you how I actually deploy these worksheets. First, I'm going to grab a link for you all in case you want to look at this mind map on your screen. Where'd my chat go? We're going to send a chat to everyone. And cool. There is that right? Someone click on that and tell me if you see this screen. Okay, you got the map. Awesome. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Elizabeth. The way that I have deployed this in in-person classes was I would have physical pieces of paper with this on it, and I would pass it out to students. Then I would stand up in front of them. I'd have this is a Google Slides presentation. I would have this sitting up on my screen, projected onto a screen, and we would do this together. Again, I'm usually deploying this with first years in mind. And that's for a few reasons. The first is that I think it's easier for most people, myself included, to be creative when you're given just a little bit of structure. So think about if you were in a like a creative writing class and the teacher said, write about anything. Take 10 minutes, write about whatever you want. I'm going to stare for 10 minutes at a blank document. I am overwhelmed with that. So what I recommend, if anyone is out there teaching a creative writing class, rather than say, write about whatever you want, say, write about a squirrel. Like, it doesn't matter what you say, but it's just to give people a focus, give them a place to look, and then they can start to like look around and make a scene and make a plot and build that squirrel into a character, whatever. I feel like I picked a weird thing to latch onto, but that's where we're at now. So that's why I use a mind map like this. I hope that it gets students to start with their topic and then branch out until we actually start forming a research question. So the other reason when I was doing in-person classes, the other reason I liked this worksheet is because most of our first year students are coming to us from high school. They are often coming to us from high schools that couldn't make assumptions about the technology available to students. So the work that they're familiar with is work that they're doing on a piece of paper with a pen or pencil. Um, so passing this out, I think it gives them the structure, but it also gives them like a little sense of like familiarity. I'm not asking them to like do anything with technology that could be intimidating. I'm not asking them to write a whole paper or even an outline. It's very clear. Here are instructions. Here's your piece of paper. Here's a pen because you all forgot your pens. Let's go. So I pass it out and then I would put this up on the screen. Now that I'm teaching digitally or virtually, I send not physical, I send a static copy of this to to the professor I'm working with. Um, I usually go with a PDF because it's easy to change these slides into PDFs. I send that to the professor so students can A, go back and get their own copy, and B, so they can keep coming back to it. They can download that copy, keep a clean version of it, and they can deploy this for themselves in their classes after this, in different classes for different assignments. So give out a static copy to professors. They can put it in the LMS. We use Blackboard. Y'all might be using Moodle or something else, but give out a static copy first. Then once we get into class, I'm going to do exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm going to share this screen and I'm going to make that as big as possible. So I remove the notes. I got rid of a menu. This isn't seeming to let me move it any smaller over here. But a weird trick I learned recently, if you hit Control minus, if you start minimizing your page, the slide gets bigger. I think that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but what it minimizes is your little menus over and above your page. So I weirdly minimize things to make this spreadsheet bigger, to make this slide bigger, and then we do exactly what I would do in person. And I say, hey, who has a topic? Who wants to give me a topic? And it's sharks, or it's my example here is climate change is one we get pretty often. And so, which is good. I'm glad we're getting that a lot. I want our students thinking about that. So this is an example that actually happened in a class, and I liked it so much that I just saved it because it was such a good example of brainstorming. So we started with climate change, and we ended up with a research question that was like, what are the effects of raising cows on greenhouse gas levels? Is federal legislation effective at curbing corporate pollution? That's really, those are good questions to be asking. So that's sort of how we do this. I go with students, I do this with them. I ask them for questions like, hey, you in the back, what questions do you have about sharks? This might not be your topic, but I bet that means you don't know much about sharks, so you should have a question. So we do this, we explore together, and I encourage them to pull keywords from different boxes to make their research question. This gives them a familiarity with research questions, it gives them a familiarity with keywords, and it gives us a chance to then jump into a database demonstration where we're using keywords, right? And that's a skill that I need them to leave able to do. I need them to ask a research question and I need them to find information, which requires them to use keywords, right? So I just glanced at the time and I need to hustle. So I was actually going to go through and do one of these with you. I don't think we have time for that. I'm sad to say. So I'm going to jump. Oh, my Zoom thing's in the way. There we go. We're going to jump back to the presentation. And the next thing that I'm going to talk about is creating an asynchronous worksheet. So I am going to pretty much be sitting on, oh, this one minimized way more than it needed to. There we go. So I'm going to kind of be sitting on one slide for a long time. So I'm going to stick in the chat 2 links to my my asynchronous worksheets. So an asynchronous worksheet is, sorry, I'm so sorry. Would someone click on one of those links and let me know that it's working for you? Make me nervous. Awesome. Cool. Thank you all very much. So creating an asynchronous worksheet takes different skills. But for me, I've really enjoyed creating them. It lets me sort of take up space in a different way. It lets me spread out in a way that I really feel like these 50-minute live sessions, I condense things and I go sometimes too quickly, I think. And this allows me to spread out, take my time, while still being respectful of the student's time. Oopsies. Here we go. Okay. When I create a digital worksheet, sorry, I have things popping up. When we create a digital worksheet like this, an asynchronous worksheet, the worksheet needs to do 100% of the lifting, right? I'm not going to be able to like do a demo. So what I do when I have a class that I need to convey information to, but where I don't have the opportunity to be in the class, either because it meets asynchronously, it functions asynchronously, or because they just don't have time to squeeze me in. These worksheets, I love them. I have a lot of fun with them. And part of the reason I love them is because I can squeeze in my little mini demos into worksheets. I've been using Google Forms, as you guys can see from those links I dropped in the chat. I use Google Forms because it allows me to put in GIFs, images, videos, as well as questions and instructions. So it's a relatively intuitive tool. I, and many of you probably, I don't feel like I have a whole lot of time to learn complicated tools. So when I've got something where like the buttons look familiar and I can just import a tutorial from YouTube, that's a really big plus for me. So that's what Google Forms is for me. So like I said, I'm just gonna hang out on this slide for like a probably long time. So feel free to just like check out those. Oh, it looks like there's a couple other like versions dropped into chat. Awesome. Check these out while I'm talking, because this slide's gonna get boring after a minute. I should also say, by the way, I think the first tool I linked to in the chat, it's the one that looks like this. I drew my examples from these. It actually doesn't have alt text on the GIFs and images. And I wanted to mention that I made copies of these worksheets before I actually deployed them. So like, I promise I fixed that. I'm not just like out there leaving my students, leaving them hanging.
Oh no, Emily's frozen. We'll give her a sec, hopefully
Oh, hang on. Okay.
There we go.
I
Good.
will. Yeah. Okay, Mandy, I'm going to get back to that at the end of the presentation. I just saw caps and I got very, very stressed. So one of the downsides to these asynchronous tools is that I don't think the professors I send them to are super, I'm not sure they go through this with a fine tooth comb. Do you know what I mean? So if any of you see something where you're like, hey, you could use this tool instead, or like, have you thought about asking this question? Please let me know. These are so easy to edit and I want to make the best tool possible. So let me know if you have any feedback.
Emily, just so you know, we're at the 10 minutes mark.
Whoop.
10-minute finish mark.
We're going to go real fast then. Okay, so Google Forms makes it really easy to stay organized. It's built for surveys, right? So you are sort of, it's intended to have like breaks. I think this is really nice. I try to stay organized, especially now that we're working virtually. I try to stay really organized for my students. They have a lot going on in their brains. I have a lot going on in my brain. It's a service to everyone to stay organized. So I use like one tool per section of the form. I put very clear instructions on the pages, and I also have the opportunity to, at the beginning and end, stick my contact information in there, and stick in information on how to save and come back to your work, which is a tricky thing in Google Forms. Let's see, 10 minutes and I want to get to questions. we're just gonna zip through here, my friends. To deploy these synchronous worksheets, I just do exactly what I did with you. I send a link to the professor. And then once the assignment has been due, I jump into Google Forms. It will put all of the responses into a worksheet, or I'm sorry, into a spreadsheet for me, a Google Sheets spreadsheet. I can download that and send the responses to the professor for grading. That also includes a timestamp, so if the professor's like a stickler for due dates, they can go there as well. Really quickly, I want to talk about assessment. Assessment takes place. I can assess how things went. I can ask the students how it went. I can ask professor how it went. The asynchronous forms are really easy to assess. In a version of one of the forms that I didn't include in the examples I sent you, one version I just started asking questions like, how do you feel about using this worksheet? And was this useful to you? I asked, do you have any questions left for me? Is there anything the librarian should know? So that gives me some feedback. I can respond to those questions and send them along to the professor when I send the responses. So I can answer some extra questions that are lingering and get feedback from the students. Are they answering questions the way I thought they would? Do I need to change things? When we're synchronous, we deploy a instruction evaluation survey so that students take. They're usually just really nice though, and they're like, it was good, which we appreciate. That makes us look great, in our the data we report, but it doesn't help us learn. So it does have room for some feedback, but the best feedback we get in synchronous sessions is from our faculty members. We can ask them sort of after the class, how did this go? What do you think? We can also go back to them at the very end of the semester or after an assignment was due and check in with them and say, hey, how did this go? Did things improve from last semester when we tried something else? What do you think? Were they successful? And finally, in a synchronous session, you can sometimes get a sense of if people are having fun, I guess, which, I mean, it matters to me. I want students to enjoy themselves. So I'm sorry I zipped through that very quickly, but now we have time for questions, all like 3 minutes. So sorry about that. Okay. Christine, have you picked up any questions?
So the question from Mandy, do you want to talk about the forms so her question is, do the forms translate well to phones, or do the toggle difficulties come back up for students?
So Mandy, I haven't gotten any feedback from students that say this didn't work for me because I'm on a phone. When I'm deploying, I need a better word than deploying. It sounds super militant. When I am sending out an asynchronous tool, I'm sending it to a class that's usually fully online. Those are the students who usually have a laptop, or they can come into the library and use a desktop there. So I'm sending these to students who I'm confident have access to technology besides just their cell phones, right? So I haven't gotten feedback on that. I have taken Google Forms surveys on my phone before, and it's pretty easy. But I think that if I were doing a worksheet on my phone, it would be difficult to see, like, the GIFs would be hard. It'd be difficult to toggle into like a browser. I think that would be tricky, so I'd avoid it. And Mandy's follow-up is, do students get a copy of their responses? They don't. I don't think I have a problem with them getting a copy of it. I have made myself very available, and very clearly I have said, if you're not sure if you submitted, call me and I will check. Email me. They don't call me. But so I have been students have reached out and said, like, I'm not sure if this worked. Can you tell me if I submitted it? And I can check. But yeah, they should be able to get a copy of their responses. That's a great idea. I should do that. I'm gonna make a note real quick. Caitlin says there's an option in Google Forms to send folks a copy when completed. Awesome. Yeah, I will look into that, because that's very doable and might make their lives a little easier. Love it. Thank you. Christine, were there any other questions I missed?
I am not seeing any questions. There's lots of comments
Okay.
about tools people are using and strategies.
Yeah.
I guess I'm kind of oh, here we go. Nancy's asking, I have trouble developing questions that align with my SLOs. Any tips?
Nancy, what kind of questions are you trying to ask? Are you trying to get students to like reflectively respond to you? Um, or are you trying to like get them, are you trying to get them to develop questions that go with SLOs? Um, if you're trying, I think, to get feedback, if you're trying to assess whether you met your SLOs using questions like in a wrap up, um, the biggest tip I can give you is take your time. Um, and that's one of the reasons I like that asynchronous worksheet is I have the space to ask several different questions. Like you might have seen, hang on, we'll go back a couple. Um, do. There we go. In this wrap up reflection, I ask things like, at the beginning, I'll ask, what does data look like? Give me 3 examples of data, and or something like that. And it preps them to start thinking about what I hope they're thinking about. And at the end, I ask these wrap up reflection questions that I hope get at questions like, if I want them to learn to be critical of maybe the state dashboard, which we had a little bit of a reason to be critical of at one point, I can ask them things like, um, who made this data? Who created this? And honestly, they might not have the correct answer, but I know that they thought about it. And to me, that's getting them a step towards those information literacy skills of questioning authority, right? Um, or if I'm thinking about, you can see one of my questions down here is give an example of how you can combine different data sources to learn something new. Um, I'm trying to sort of here get them out of that bubble of like, this is the tool I use, this is where I learn, and do some synthesizing themselves, which is another thing that I'm trying to get to happen with that um, that worksheet that gets them into research questions. I'm trying to get them to synthesize some thoughts they have into one thing. Oh, okay. Nope, I was off the mark with Nancy's question. Okay. Multiple choice questions for students to answer that assess whether or not they met an SLO. Um, so I know there are some tools out there that exist. There's one that's they're like big evaluation assessment tools though. They're like programmatic, not like in a certain class, but they do ask questions like, here's an example of a headline. Um, or maybe they'll show you an image of a newspaper or something and they'll say like, who wrote this, or like who publishes this information. So you could ask them to actually like perform the skill, and have them actually like prove that they learned what you want them to learn. That's an option. um, I tend to go for open-ended things, so I might not have a super useful response. Does anyone else have advice on this? um, Trying to ask like multiple choice questions where students can uh, sort of prove that they've used something. Um, I did, Nancy, in one of the things I linked above, in the second example of an asynchronous worksheet, I asked students to go into our discovery tool. We call it a quick search. And I asked them to like, hey, search this thing. How many results did you get? Um, it is an open-ended question. Um, and you're right, Nancy, they're so much easier to grade and we have limited time. So if you want to do something like that, like how many results did you get? Or like um, click the correct citation for that article or something like that. You can do that. I recommend before you send that tool out again though, for maybe a second time, go through and make sure that that's still the correct answer. If you're doing something like how many results did you get in our discovery layer, that's going to change like month to month, right? When we get more, you know, new things were published on that subject, so they're going to have more results. So that's I think doable. It's going to require some maintenance though.
Okay, Emily, we are at time, believe it or not. Thank
Oh
you
my
very much,
goodness.
everyone. Thank you, Emily, for sharing your presentation with us, and everyone for attending. We are going to take a break for lunch for some of us, or just a break for some of other people that are in different time zones, and we'll resume in about an hour at 12:30 Central Time. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. And